The autumn sun cast long shadows across the pristine streets of Georgetown, where Officer David Chen patrolled in his standard-issue police cruiser. The neighborhood's manicured lawns and historic brownstones painted a picture of privilege and security that Chen had sworn to protect. It was a routine afternoon shift, just like any other, until it wasn't. As Chen turned onto N Street, his attention was drawn to a teenage boy in an olive-green hoodie standing near one of the Victorian-style homes. The boy's pristine white sneakers probably cost more than Chen's entire uniform, but something about the way he kept checking his phone and glancing around set off Chen's internal alarm bells. The streets were quieter than usual that day. Most kids were still in school, which made the boy's presence even more suspicious to Chen. 20 years on the force had taught him to trust his instincts, though those same instincts had sometimes led him astray. He'd been working this beat long enough to know most of the local residents, but this teenager wasn't familiar. Chen pulled his cruiser to a slow stop, watching through his side mirror as the boy paced back and forth on the sidewalk. The teenager's hood was pulled up despite the mild weather, and he kept his head down, focused on his phone. Through the car's open window, Chen could hear the faint sound of music playing through the boy's expensive wireless earbuds. The more Chen observed, the more his suspicion grew. Recent reports of high-end burglaries in the area had everyone on edge. The thieves had been targeting homes during school hours, and their sophisticated methods suggested they did thorough surveillance before each hit. Could this be their scout? Chen radioed in his location and stepped out of his vehicle. The sound of his car door shutting echoed off the brick facades of the nearby houses. A couple of dog walkers on the other side of the street paused to watch the scene unfold, their pets tugging impatiently at their leashes. "Good afternoon," Chen called out, his hand resting casually near his belt as he approached. The boy didn't respond, still absorbed in his phone. Chen's steps quickened, and his voice took on a more authoritative tone. "Hey, police officer, I need to speak with you." The teenager looked up, startled by the sudden command. He pulled out one earbud, revealing a face that somehow seemed familiar to Chen, though he couldn't quite place it. The boy's expression showed confusion rather than fear or guilt, but Chen had seen plenty of good actors in his time. "Sir?" the boy asked, his voice carrying the kind of confidence that came from a privileged upbringing. He stood straight, nearly as tall as Chen, wearing what the officer now recognized as designer clothes that probably cost more than his monthly salary. Around them, the quiet neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. A few more residents had emerged onto their porches, phones already raised to record whatever might happen next. None of them could have guessed they were about to witness an incident that would spark a national conversation and force America to once again confront some of its deepest social issues. Little did Officer Chen know that his next actions would not only change his life forever, but would also become a pivotal moment in the ongoing debate about law enforcement reform in America. As he took his next step toward the boy, the weight of what was about to unfold hung invisible in the autumn air, like storm clouds gathering before a summer thunderstorm. Officer Chen closed the distance between them in just a few quick strides. His heart was pounding now, years of training and street experience taking over. "I need to see some ID," he demanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. The boy's hand moved slowly toward his back pocket, but Chen's patience was already wearing thin. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Chen pressed, not waiting for the ID. The question came out harsher than he'd intended, echoing off the brick walls of the nearby homes. More neighbors had gathered now, their presence adding to the mounting tension in the air. "I live here," the boy replied calmly, his hand still reaching for his wallet. There was something in his composure that irritated Chen even more, a sort of unshakable confidence that seemed to challenge his authority. "My friend's running late, so I'm just waiting for." "Keep your hands where I can see them," Chen suddenly barked, cutting him off. The boy froze, both hands now raised slightly. The afternoon sun caught the silver chain around his neck, momentarily blinding Chen. Something about that necklace tugged at his memory, but he pushed the thought aside. A woman walking her golden retriever had stopped about 20 feet away, her phone now recording the scene. Another neighbor stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching intently. The boy noticed them too, but his expression remained surprisingly composed. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding," the boy said, his voice steady despite the situation. "If you'll just let me show you my ID." He began to lower one hand, moving slowly and deliberately. Chen's training kicked in automatically. In his mind, any unexpected movement could signal a threat. "I said don't move," he shouted, reaching for the boy's arm. The teen instinctively pulled back, trying to maintain his personal space. The next few seconds seemed to unfold in slow motion. A car turned onto the street, its tires crunching on fallen leaves. Someone gasped. The boy's phone slipped from his hand, clattering on the sidewalk. Chen's grip tightened, his fingers digging into the expensive fabric of the hoodie. "Stop resisting," Chen commanded, though the boy wasn't actually fighting back. More phones were recording now, capturing every moment of what was quickly becoming a serious mistake. The autumn breeze carried whispers from the growing crowd of onlookers. Just then, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows that had been parked down the street roared to life. Chen barely registered its movement in his peripheral vision, too focused on maintaining control of the situation. The boy remained surprisingly calm, even as Chen forced him to turn around. "Officer, please," the boy said, his voice still steady but carrying a note of warning that Chen missed entirely. "You really don't want to do this. Just let me explain." But Chen wasn't listening anymore. All he could think about were the recent burglary reports, his own reputation on the force, and his certainty that this kid was up to no good in his jurisdiction. He couldn't have known that in the next few moments, his entire world was about to turn upside down. The situation escalated in a matter of seconds. Chen's grip on the boy's arm tightened as he attempted to force him against the wall of the nearest brownstone. The teenager's expensive phone lay forgotten on the ground, its screen still glowing with an unread message. "Please just listen," the boy tried one last time, his voice carrying a hint of resignation now. "This isn't what you think." But his words were drowned out by Chen's commanding tone as he recited the familiar words. "You have the right to remain silent." The gathering crowd had grown larger, their phones capturing every moment. An elderly man stepped forward, trying to intervene. "Officer, I know this young man. He really does live in the neighborhood." Chen barely heard him, focused entirely on what he perceived as a potential threat. Suddenly, the black SUV that had been idling down the street screeched to a halt beside them. The doors flew open before the vehicle had completely stopped. 3 men in dark suits emerged, moving with practiced precision. Their presence seemed to change the very atmosphere of the peaceful Georgetown street. "Secret Service, stand down immediately." The command rang out clear and sharp, freezing Chen in place. His mind struggled to process what was happening as one of the agents quickly stepped between him and the boy. Another agent was already speaking rapidly into his wrist microphone. "Eagle Jr. secure. Situation contained." The color drained from Chen's face as realization dawned. The familiar features he couldn't quite place earlier, the expensive clothes, the unshakable composure. It all suddenly made terrible sense. This wasn't just any teenager. This was the president's son. Time seemed to stand still on that autumn afternoon. The gentle breeze carried fallen leaves across the scene as Chen's world collapsed around him. The boy was now surrounded by protective agents, one of whom was carefully checking him for injuries while another retrieved his phone from the ground. The neighbors who had gathered to watch now stood in shocked silence. Someone whispered, "Oh my God, that's the first son." The word spread through the crowd like wildfire, accompanied by the sound of furious typing as social media posts began their journey into the digital world. Chen stood rooted to the spot, his badge feeling suddenly heavy on his chest. 20 years of service, countless commendations, all potentially undone by 5 minutes of poor judgment. He watched as more black vehicles arrived, their lights flashing silently. His radio crackled with confused chatter from dispatch, but he couldn't find the words to respond. The incident unfolded with frightening speed. As Chen tried to restrain the boy, his police training kicked in automatically, but something went terribly wrong. The boy's attempt to keep his balance was misinterpreted as resistance, and Chen reacted with excessive force. In a swift motion, both of them went down onto the hard sidewalk. A collective gasp rose from the crowd as the boy's head narrowly missed the concrete, saved only by the quick reaction of one of the Secret Service agents who had lunged forward to break his fall. The sound of the struggle echoed off the brownstone walls, accompanied by the rustle of the boy's expensive hoodie against the rough pavement. Through the chaos, someone in the crowd shouted, "He's just a kid." Another voice called out, "I'm sending this to the news." The clicks and beeps of phone cameras filled the air as residents captured every moment of the unfolding disaster. The autumn wind carried their worried murmurs down the street. The Secret Service team moved with practiced efficiency. 2 agents carefully helped the first son to his feet, while another firmly but professionally removed Chen's hands from the situation. The boy winced, holding his wrist close to his chest. A small cut above his eyebrow had started to bleed, a stark red against his pale skin. Chen stood frozen, his training deserting him as the reality of what he'd done sank in. He just injured the president's son, the same boy whose pictures he'd seen countless times on the news, whose school achievements had been celebrated across the nation. The same teenager who, just last month, had been praised for his volunteer work with inner-city youth programs. More black SUVs arrived, their tires crunching on fallen leaves. Men and women in dark suits and earpieces emerged, securing the perimeter with silent efficiency. One agent was already on the phone, presumably with the White House. Another was photographing the scene, documenting every detail of the incident. Chen watched helplessly as a medical team that seemed to materialize from nowhere began examining the boy's injuries. The wrist was already swelling, and the cut above his eye would need attention. Despite his injuries, the first son maintained his composure, though his face was pale with pain and shock. "ID," the boy said quietly, finally pulling out his wallet with his good hand. "This is what I was trying to show you." The words hit Chen like physical blows, each one highlighting the magnitude of his mistake. The teenager's security pass, with the presidential seal clearly visible, seemed to mock Chen's rush to judgment. The crowd had grown larger now, their phones still recording as news of the incident spread through social media like wildfire. In the distance, sirens wailed. More police responding to a situation that had already spiraled far beyond their jurisdiction. Chen's radio crackled with his captain's voice, demanding an update, but he couldn't find the words to explain how thoroughly he'd just destroyed his career. The revelation hit the scene like a thunderbolt. The Secret Service agents had moved with lightning speed, their presence transforming the quiet Georgetown street into what looked like a scene from a high-stakes political thriller. Chen's stomach dropped as the full weight of his actions crashed down upon him. Officer Chen, a senior Secret Service agent, stepped forward, his voice controlled but stern. "I need your badge number and a full report of what happened here." Behind him, the first son was receiving medical attention, his wrist being carefully wrapped as another agent documented his injuries with a camera. The crowd had doubled in size, their phones capturing every moment. Local news vans were already pulling up at both ends of the street, reporters rushing out with microphones and cameras. The afternoon sun caught their equipment, sending bright flashes across the scene. A young woman from the crowd stepped forward, her phone still recording. "I had the whole thing on video," she announced. From the moment the officer approached him. Other witnesses nodded, several stating they too had footage. Chen felt his professional life crumbling with each word. Inside the White House, the news was already spreading like wildfire. The president had been in a national security briefing when his chief of staff burst in with the news. Secret Service communications crackled with updates about the first son's condition, each word echoing across secure channels to the highest levels of government. Back on the street, Chen watched as his supervising officer arrived, face grim as he took in the scene. The captain's usual confident stride faltered as he realized exactly who was involved in this incident. This wasn't just a case of police misconduct. This was a national security incident that would make headlines across the globe. The first son's security detail had already established a protective perimeter, their expressions professional, but their eyes constantly scanning for threats. One agent was speaking rapidly into his phone. "Yes, sir. Minor injuries. Medical team is assessing." "Yes, sir. The president is being briefed now." Chen stood alone now, other officers keeping their distance as if his mistake might be contagious. His mind raced through every moment of the confrontation, each decision now seeming more foolish than the last. The boy's expensive clothes, his composed demeanor, the way he had tried to explain. All the signs he had misread or ignored. A gentle autumn breeze stirred the fallen leaves around their feet, the peaceful day continuing as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. In less than 15 minutes, Officer Chen had not only injured the president's son, but had also become the face of everything wrong with law enforcement in America. Within hours, the incident had become the nation's biggest story. News helicopters circled over Georgetown, their cameras focused on the spot where it all happened. The video, captured by multiple bystanders, was playing on every major network. Social media exploded with millions of shares, likes, and angry comments. The footage was crystal clear, showing every moment from Chen's aggressive approach to the shocking takedown. News anchors dissected each frame, their voices grave as they discussed the implications. Political commentators from across the spectrum weighed in, turning the incident into a national conversation about law enforcement practices. In downtown Washington, protesters began gathering outside police headquarters. Their signs told the story: "Protect all our children, and no more prejudice." The crowd grew larger as evening approached, their chants echoing off the city buildings. Police officers stood guard, their faces showing the strain of being thrust into the spotlight. Inside the White House medical unit, doctors confirmed the first son had suffered a sprained wrist and minor facial bruising. The medical report would later become public record, its clinical language describing injuries that should never have happened. Each word added fuel to the growing public outrage. News outlets began digging into Chen's background: 20 years on the force, multiple commendations, no serious complaints until now. Experts debated on live TV. How could a decorated officer make such a devastating mistake? What did this say about policing in America? The questions seemed endless. Local residents who witnessed the incident were interviewed on every channel. He was just standing there, waiting for his friend. One neighbor repeated for the 10th time that day. The officer didn't even give him a chance to explain. Their testimonies painted a damning picture of prejudice and rushed judgment. The police department's public affairs office was overwhelmed with media requests. Their initial statement, promising a thorough investigation, did little to calm the growing storm. Social media influencers and celebrities joined the conversation, their millions of followers ensuring the story wouldn't fade quietly away. As evening fell, news crews remained stationed outside the White House gates, waiting for an official response. The president's press secretary had already postponed the daily briefing twice, buying time as they crafted their response to this personal and political crisis. The nation held its breath, waiting to hear from a father whose son had just become the face of a movement. This wasn't just another viral video. This was a moment that would force America to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice, power, and justice. As night settled over Washington, the story continued to spread, promising changes that would ripple through law enforcement agencies across the country. The president stood behind the podium in the White House press room, his face showing the strain of the past few hours. The usual formality of his office had been stripped away, replaced by something more personal. the raw emotion of a father whose child had been hurt. "Today, my son became a statistic," he began, his voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of pain. "Not as the first son, but as one of countless young people who face prejudice on our streets every day." The room fell silent, cameras clicking softly as journalists captured this unprecedented moment. The president gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles white with tension. Behind him, his staff stood solemn, watching their leader navigate the delicate balance between his roles as the nation's chief executive and a concerned parent. The First Lady sat in the front row, her face a mask of controlled emotion. "I've watched the video, just as many of you have," he continued. "I've seen my son try to explain himself, to show his ID, to de-escalate a situation that should never have happened. As president, I'm deeply troubled. As a father, I'm heartbroken." The press room remained unusually quiet, the usual shouted questions replaced by attentive silence. This wasn't just another political speech. This was a moment of raw authenticity that transcended party lines. The president's pain was palpable, his words carrying the weight of both personal anguish and national responsibility. "We must do better," he declared, his voice growing stronger. "Not just for my son, but for every child who has ever felt unsafe in their own neighborhood. For every parent who has had to have the talk with their children about how to survive a police encounter. For every American who believes in the promise of equal justice under law." He outlined immediate actions: a comprehensive review of police training protocols, increased funding for community policing programs, and a national task force on law enforcement reform. But it was his personal words that resonated most strongly. "My son is recovering at home now," the president shared, his voice softening. "His physical injuries will heal. But the scars this incident leaves on our national conscience must not be allowed to fade. We must use this moment to create real, lasting change." The speech lasted barely 15 minutes, but its impact would be felt for years to come. As the president left the podium, declining to take questions, the press room erupted in activity. This wasn't just a story about one incident anymore. It was a catalyst for national transformation. The consequences of that fateful afternoon rolled through the police department like a tidal wave. Officer Chen sat in the chief's office, his badge and gun already surrendered, as internal affairs investigators pored over his service record. The usually bustling police headquarters had grown quiet, officers speaking in hushed tones as they passed by. 20 years of exemplary service, the chief said, shaking his head while reviewing Chen's file. Not a single complaint of excessive force. Until today. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the office windows, highlighting the stress lines on both men's faces. Outside, protesters remained gathered, their numbers growing as evening approached. Their chants echoed through the building's walls. "Reform now." Local community leaders had joined the crowd, giving interviews to the swarm of news crews that had set up camp around the building. The department's training coordinator was already implementing emergency changes. All officers were being called in for mandatory sensitivity sessions. The instructors had pulled up the video footage, using it as a teaching tool for what not to do. Chen's mistakes would become a case study in police academies across the nation. In a conference room down the hall, the department's legal team huddled with city attorneys. The footage had gone viral, viewed millions of times across social media platforms. Legal experts on TV were already predicting a massive lawsuit, one that could reshape department policies nationwide. Chen watched through the chief's office window as another news van pulled up outside. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing with messages from fellow officers, some offering support, others keeping their distance. His union representative had already advised him to prepare for a long legal battle. The internal affairs investigation moved with unprecedented speed. Witness statements were taken, security camera footage was collected, and Chen's body camera data was downloaded and analyzed. Every moment of the incident was being scrutinized from multiple angles. On the chief's desk, A preliminary report outlined the immediate changes being implemented: revised approach protocols, enhanced de-escalation training, and mandatory cultural sensitivity workshops. Chen's incident had become a catalyst for transformation, forcing the department to confront its deepest institutional problems. 6 months after the incident, the halls of Congress buzzed with anticipation. The first son, fully recovered from his injuries, prepared to address a special joint session on police reform. His presence commanded attention, not as the president's son, but as a young man whose experience had sparked a national movement. The chamber fell silent as he approached the podium. Gone was the casual hoodie from that autumn day, replaced by a tailored suit that highlighted his transition from victim to advocate. His wrist, long healed, gripped the edges of the podium as he began his testimony. "What happened to me was not unique," he stated, his voice clear and confident. "The only unique thing was that it happened to someone whose father lives in the White House." The words echoed through the chamber, cameras catching the solemn nods from both sides of the aisle. In the audience, Officer Chen sat listening intently. After months of sensitivity training and deep reflection, he had become an unexpected voice for change within law enforcement. His journey from that fateful day had transformed him from a symbol of what was wrong to an advocate for what could be right. The police academy had completely revised its training program. New recruits now spent more time learning about community relations and unconscious bias than ever before. Chen's body camera footage had become a standard teaching tool, showing future officers how quickly assumptions and prejudice could lead to disaster. The first son's testimony laid out practical solutions: better training, community involvement in police oversight, and new protocols for routine stops. His words carried the weight of personal experience, but his message was about hope rather than blame. Change isn't just possible, he concluded, it's happening right now in police departments across our country. What matters is that we learn from our mistakes and work together to build a better system for everyone. As applause filled the chamber, Chen reflected on his own journey. He'd lost his badge, but found a new purpose. Now he traveled to police departments nationwide, sharing his story and helping other officers recognize their own biases before they led to similar mistakes. The incident that could have ended careers and divided communities had instead become a catalyst for positive change. As the first son left the podium, the legislation he advocated for was already gaining bipartisan support, promising real reforms that would protect both citizens and officers alike.